I'm Cliff Ribner, and I'm going to talk to you today about one of the great poisons in our life. It's one of the greatest, it's a cancer. Everywhere it appears, both in individuals and in societies, and it's collectivism. It has all different forms. One form of it is racism. Collectivism is whenever someone looks at people not as individuals, but as members of some group that those people have no choice but to be part of, like racism. Racism is a classic example. Whenever you're talking to someone who says something like, me as a black woman thinks, or someone who identifies other people simply by virtue of their race or their sex, that's a form of collectivism. It's looking at people not as individuals, but as members of a group. And we all know that it's inherently unfair. Whenever you judge people other than individually, whenever judgment is imposed on people as anything other than as individuals for their own deeds, it's evil. It's the opposite of justice. That's what the word social justice, which Democrats always talk about as being something virtuous. Real justice doesn't need an adjective in front of it. Real justice is what's really fair. When they talk about fairness, that's what's fair. When there is real justice, when people are recognized for who they are, when they get what they deserve, literally, either as a punishment or as a reward. That's what real justice is, and when justice has an adjective in front of it, it's not justice. It's the opposite of justice. It's injustice, because there's only either justice or injustice. Any adjective in front of it makes it injustice, and that's the last thing any of us really want. We want everything to be actually fair and just. And this country was set up to be that way. Individual liberty. Individual liberty is the opposite of collective rights, or it's what this country is founded to preserve. That's what a republic is, where the majority rules anytime they vote. That's true of both the voting for our elected officials and among the elected officials. When they vote, they have to vote by majority rule. If they don't do that, then it's not a fair vote, unless there are special situations. Like in our Constitution, there are specific situations which the Senate, for example, is required, or the House, is required to vote by a supermajority when they override a presidential veto, or when they convict someone in an impeachment. That requires a supermajority, where the minority has to join with the majority to vote. Because when the minority's vote is required, if the majority can't reach the vote, they have to pay off the minority, and then you have corruption. And that's what we have today in our Senate. That's the Senate. There's one procedure they have created, is called the budget reconciliation procedure. That's what President Trump and the Republicans were involved in with what they call the one big beautiful bill. They had to put everything in the one big beautiful bill, because that's part of the budget reconciliation procedure that they have invented as an exception to the preposterous filibuster rule that's been there since 1806, when Aaron Burr, as part of his plot to commit treason against America, got the Senate to adopt it. That's the reason they have it. And they keep it because the senators individually corruptly benefit from it. It gives the senators, and the senators alone, power over us. And it's a terrible thing. And that's an example of injustice. They're breaking the law. The Constitution doesn't permit them to amend the Constitution by adopting a rule like that. They're allowed to pass their own special rules. It's in Article 1. They're allowed to pass rules for their own that affect their internal proceedings. they're not allowed to amend the Constitution with those rules. And that's exactly what they did with the filibuster rule. That's an example of injustice, and I'm accusing them collectivistically. So in that sense, I'm committing collectivism. But collectivism is something you have to look out for to see, is collectivism going on here? Because if it is, it's guaranteed to be unfair, except in very specific situations. Now, collectivism was not really a political philosophy until the French Revolution. Prior to that, there were monarchies, and that's basically the way all the countries were ruled. There was a monarchy. Sometimes the nobility had more power than the king, so it was close to an oligarchy. That's actually the way it was in France. For a long time, the nobles had more power than the king. Louis XIV, as a child, experienced terrible terror, where he and his mother and brother had to flee the city of Paris, and they barely got out alive. The nobles were attacking them, and it was very dangerous for them. To prevent that from ever happening again, when Louis XIV became king for real, he used collectivism. He got all the noble. That's what Versailles was all about. It was a gilded cage to imprison the nobility. He wanted the nobility under his thumb, and he wanted the whole country under his thumb. And what he did was he created bureaucracy. He created the idea of central control, where the king's approval, either directly or through his representatives, had to be obtained to do anything. You couldn't change the roof on your house, if you had a house, without getting the approval. They called them intendants, but it was the beginning of the idea of bureaucracy, and they put that into law. And that same principle, that tyranny, was used in every single country in Europe. They all imitated it. But what happened was Napoleon copied the laws that Louis XIV had created and called it the Napoleonic Code. It was the same thing. And when Napoleon conquered all of Europe, he imposed those laws on Europe. And even when Napoleon was gone, all those laws have still been there the whole time. It's different from the UK. The UK had a different legal system, the common law, completely different. And we benefit from that. The common law, its whole purpose is to apply the 10 Commandments to real-life situations. It was developed by judges over many centuries, and they have the common law. There's a law of property, a law of torts. Torts are civil wrongs, things like battery, that's an intentional tort, or negligence. If you get in a car wreck and you accuse someone of being responsible for the wreck, negligence, that's a tort. Otherwise, and it's a French word. England was conquered by the Normans in 1066, so a lot of French terms were imposed on the British. But anyway, and there's a law, so there's the law of property, torts, there's criminal law, and there's a law of contracts. And our Constitution, remarkably, was based on the law of contracts. It is a contract, but its contents are very unique. No other country in the world has ever had what we have. In the Constitution, it defines with great specificity each of the 3 branches of government. They divided the power because Madison said in the Federalist 47, James Madison was the principal author of the Constitution, although it was adopted by a convention, and then it was approved by each of the states. But in the Federalist 47, he quoted Montesquieu saying, whenever the 3 powers, judicial, executive, and legislative, are combined in one place, it is a tyranny. That's the greatest tyranny that can happen. It's the very definition of tyranny. That's his words. And he was absolutely right. And that type of tyranny is involved in every one of those administrative agencies. Those agencies, the nature of bureaucracy is it's a collective. There are mental aspects to how the bureaucracy thinks. Bureaucracies always promote their own interests. When they were under the thumb of the King of France, at least he thought of his kingdom as his property, and he wanted it run well. They had to answer to him. But we don't have a king, and the president is not a king. They don't. In fact, over the years, in 1883, Congress passed this civil service legislation, and they permitted unions. A union is a collective. The nature of a union. In fact, there's two types of unions. There are public employee unions and private unions. Unions would all be completely illegal in America, by the way. There is a tort of tortious interference with contract. That's what a union does. It interposes itself between the employees and the employer. They always refer to the employees as workers, but it prevents the employee and the employer from working out their own contractual relationships, not just compensation, but everything. And the union gets involved and creates these union contracts. One size fits all. The only reason it's legal is actually unconstitutional federal laws that legalized it. Otherwise, it would be illegal in every state to have a union. And they also violate antitrust laws in various ways. Anyway, unions are just complete. They are horrendous. They interfere with the employment relationships. People who think that the employees make more money because of the presence of the unions, that's not true. That's why unions can't win votes unless they play dirty tricks. Now, public employee unions are a whole different thing. They don't get involved. What they do is they intrude on the rights of citizens, because as citizens, we have the right to elect our officials, and those officials have to be responsible and empowered over all public employees at the state level and the federal level. The union intrudes in that whole thing. So it changes the republic from being a republic. It violates the guarantee clause of the Constitution to have a public employee union, because it means that the legislature no longer and the executive no longer have the kind of control they're supposed to have over the employees of the government. They're supposed to be able to hire them and fire them at will and tell them what to do and fix their pay. If people don't want to work for it, then they won't. But what the union does, it gives them rights. Public employees are not supposed to have any rights in a republic. The people, the citizens, are the only ones with rights. The government has to protect us from public employees with rights. When they have rights, then they're empowered, and they have to answer to no one. And they shouldn't have that kind of power because nobody elected them. It's that simple. And by the way, all those federal bureaucracies have all three powers. Exactly what Madison said is the very definition of tyranny. They have legislative, executive, and judicial power. They give orders to people. Under the common law, the only way anybody can be ordered to do anything is if a court orders him to do it. After proceedings in court, after due process, that's how you get an order. It's what's called something in a court of equity. Every one of those agencies acts as a court of equity, where it's the judge and the jury. It makes the decision, and they even write their own laws. They call them regulations, because the Constitution is very specific. In Article 1, Section 7, it says procedures that have to be complied with in order for a law to be a real law. None of that qualifies. They're all passed by bureaucrats in the dead of night, as opposed to being done according to the rules of the Constitution. Congress created the Administrative Procedure Act in 1948 to pretend that they had come up with a way to put a blessing on those regulations and the way these administrative agencies operate, trying to pretend that they could make it constitutional, but they can't, because it's really, none of it is constitutional. The agencies themselves are unconstitutional. They have power over the citizens that no agency should ever have, the power to order us around, and they even impose fines. That's what only a court can do in our system. So that tells you right there that every one of them is completely wrong and imposing a tyranny on us that we're not supposed to have. They are how collectivism operates. They are the opposite of individual liberty. And collectivism was the first time it was actually promoted as a political philosophy was in the French Revolution. Then, after Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848, communism basically became the form of collectivism. And it's the words are used, they don't use the word collectivism much, but it's what really describes what they're talking about. They're taking power and money away from individuals, giving it to the collective, and then the collective is supposed to have the power to improve everyone else's life. It never happens in real life. The fact that racism itself that's the accusation that collectivists make against everyone who attacks them. They accuse them of being a racist. It's literally the pot calling the kettle black. And it all started with Karl Marx, actually. What it is in America, we were, even though we were dedicated to individual liberty, when the country was founded, we had this anomaly left over from the old civilization. We did have slavery. We didn't invent it. It was something that was left over. The black slaves in this country had been purchased from black slavers in Africa. We had a very tiny portion of the slaves from Africa, about 3%. And by the way, there were vastly more white Europeans who were enslaved by Arabs primarily than were enslaved in both America. 90% of the slaves from Africa ended up in the Caribbean. There were vastly more white people who were turned into slaves. And the Arabs still do this. Slavery did not end. The only places slavery ended throughout history was in Britain and the United States. Britain made slavery completely illegal in 1832. We made it completely illegal in 1865. That's never happened in history before. But what it is slavery based on race, or in part on race, was a complete anomaly that we had, and it's what Karl Marx identified as the one thing he could accuse us of doing wrong. And he basically, if you listen to his accusations of America, it sounds just like Al Sharpton today. Al Sharpton today is accusing us of being racist. He is a classic collectivist communist, and he's the real racist. The accusation that all of America is racist is a collectivist accusation. It's complete nonsense. We are the only country, all of whose laws and taboos absolutely forbid racism. That's why they continue to use that as their smear, to smear their opponents who are opposed to collectivism, communism, socialism. They use it. They call us racist because that's them projecting what they really are. America is the very fact that that is insulting. To call someone a racist tells you exactly that all of our laws and taboos make racism in any form the worst thing anybody could be. It's absolutely, that's why all of our laws and taboos forbid it. And it's extremely rare to find anyone who's a racist other than collectivists. Every collectivist guaranteed the first accusation out of his mouth against anyone who attacks them is, you're a racist, and they are racist themselves. They talk in racial terms. They accuse white people of being white. They talk about whiteness as something that's terrible, and they don't differentiate between anyone. Everyone's a racist if they disagree with them. And that's their accusation. And it's a complete lie, because they are the real collectivists. racism is a collectivist way of thinking. But by very definition, you refuse to look at the individual. You don't want individual justice. You want things like reparations, having white people today pay for slaves who have been dead for 150 years just because they're white and those other people were black. That is, by definition, a collectivist form of injustice. Even talking about reparations, anyone who talks about it is a bigot, and they're not interested in individual liberty. That's the whole point. They're only interested in collectivist judgments on people. And I'm Cliff Ribner, and if you like what I have to say, I hope you like this video, and you can watch my other stuff at cliffordribner.com, and you might like my book, Freedom's Last Stand. Thank you.